Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Welcome to all. Thank you so much for joining us for this, which is our first Canada Roadshow webinar in 2023. Again, thank you all for coming and joining. My name is Mark Lippman, and I'm the president of Lloyd's here in Canada. Pleasure to have you with us. I know it's already January 26th, but I guess I could sneak it in under the wire and let me wish all of our people who've joined us still a happy new year. I think I'm probably allowed to say that until the end of January. Thank you all for being with us. We have a great agenda today. Fantastic presenter. I'm looking really forward to hearing and learning about a whole special suite of products today. And so we have Charlie Hanbury with us today, who is the CEO of Samphire Risk. Charlie's here to talk to us about a whole suite of products, as I said, addressing malicious and hostile risks to people and assets, both here in Canada and overseas. And I guess I'm excited about today's presentation because I think it really demonstrates the expertise and the breadth of the product offering that is really unique to Lloyd's. It's the kind of insurance products and risk consulting expertise that Lloyd's really excels at, that it's known for around the world. So I'm excited that we can highlight that today and have Charlie with us to do so. So perhaps just a quick introduction before I turn it over to Charlie. As I said, Charlie is the CEO of Samphire Risk. Charlie has over 18 years of experience in the crisis management insurance market, initially with Aon, and then 14 years with Lloyd's syndicate Hiscox, where he was responsible for the management of the Kidnap and Ransom portfolio and product innovation in that area as well. Along with his fellow founders who also have equal depth of experience, Charlie set up Samphire Risk in 2021 with the aim of making products that address hostile and malicious risk accessible and fit for purpose in a rapidly changing risk environment. And I think, if anything, we've certainly become accustomed to rapidly evolving risks over the past 3 years or so. Samphire Risk offers numerous products across the risk spectrum, as well as unique insights and analysis of the threats that Samphire's clients face. So without further delay, Charlie, I'll turn it over to you and let you lead our audience through your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to you and Asima for inviting me in this morning, this afternoon over here in the UK. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to speak to your network. So I'm going to talk roughly for 35 minutes, hopefully, and very happy to take questions on the fly as we go along, if that suits people. Otherwise, obviously, at the end. Anyway, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see that. So anyway, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. As I say, today's session is about addressing malicious and hostile risk to people and assets in what we are focusing on at home and overseas. Now, of course, this is quite a broadly titled topic, and I guess we could explore any number of avenues, but in the time I've got, I want to focus on some specific areas where participants in the Lloyd's market are bringing specialism, expertise, and innovation to address what we hopefully will demonstrate in this presentation is a pretty complex risk environment, increasingly so. So with that, I would kind of like to start with the context of what's driving risk, but briefly, just kind of some background on who we are. Obviously, Mark touched on it, but we're an independent MGA, MGU, cover holder at Lloyd's. We're very, very proud to represent the Lloyd's franchise and name all around the world, but particularly in Canada, which is a really key market for us and where we've had experience over many years of working. So we hope we bring as Mark touched upon, the best of Lloyd's to the Canadian market, which is great products, innovation, and of course backed by that fantastic financial stability of the corporation. So we're really very proud to be associated and to be talking to you here today. So what do we mean by kind of malicious and hostile risk? And I suppose our chosen way of referring to that is what you see on the screen now. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but many of these scenarios are covered by existing or new and creative insurance policies. And almost without exception, they are focused very much on human risk and by extension, kind of duty of care that corporates increasingly face. And through this prism, the core is often at the delivery via the insurance of expertise and resource to help mitigate, manage, and respond to these kind of events. So for today's session, I'm going to be focusing on 3 core areas of insurance product that in one way or another address many of these risks and threats that you see on the screen now. Active assailant, active shooter cover, as it's known, kidnap for ransom insurance, and less widely known in the market, but increasingly coming to market, broad form crisis response cover. Now that sounds a little generic, and I hope that I'll be able to explain later in the presentation what I actually mean by that. And I've no doubt that many of you on the session today will have an idea or even a good understanding of some of these products and these risks on the screen and how they're addressed. So my intent today is not to get too granular, but rather to give an overview of what each product can do, who it's typically relevant to, and in what context they sit in the current risk environment we find ourselves in. So my hope is you'll leave the session with an understanding of why there's relevance to these types of insurance that is perhaps wider than the perception that they currently have. But starting with some context, because I think that's important. I think we all agree that we sit in extraordinarily challenging times at a kind of macro level. It feels like people always start presentations about this type of risk with that type of comment. But, even saying that a decade or 2 decades ago, perhaps doesn't feel quite as challenging as now. We're emerging from the first global pandemic for 100 years. We have potentially major power conflict closer than any time since the Cold War. And, systemic changes and systemic threats to our habitat. So it kind of does feel justified in the perhaps slightly hyperbolic, we are living in extraordinarily challenging times from a security risk environment. So these are the 3 main issues I've chosen to focus on. And I suppose they're no surprise. And I'd like just to kind of touch on each theme with a specific. So if you look at the economic environment we're in globally, it's put pressure on every government, more or less without exception, and the social contract, if that's the right way of putting it, that they have with their populations. The increasing cost of staple essentials, the increasing cost of servicing debt in the interest rate environment we're in, have left, in particular, developing nations and developing nation governments with less levers to pull than perhaps they had in the past to do things like subsidize essentials, energy, food, fuel, whatever it may be, for the requirements of their people. So what does this mean for the kind of political stability in those locations and the subsequent security environment? You've seen already in places like Sri Lanka, the potential of how these things can flare up with governments effectively lose the control to be able to keep that social contract in place. Secondly, war in Europe. I mean, in and of itself, a terrible conflict causing strife on the eastern part of the continent. But where does this war lead us? From a great power competition perspective, nuclear power competition. The world's increasingly taking sides here. A small example, but nonetheless perhaps important. Recently Burkina Faso had expelled French troops who had been maintaining a degree of the security environment there and replaced them with the Wagner Group. As I'm sure most are familiar with, a kind of a private Russian army, effectively. The surge too of weapons into Ukraine could have huge implications down the line. We saw it following the Balkans conflict of the 1990s. It still has ripple effects with weapons that found their way into the hands of criminal organizations and even terrorist organizations, as the kind of chaos of war, the flooding of weapons into an area, what comes thereafter. And just this morning, actually, I was meeting in London with a security business operating on the ground in Ukraine who's seen with their own eyes the proliferation of weapons and movement of weapons by non-military, non-formal organizations with more or less impunity. So where are these weapons going to end up? I think this is potentially a big question of our time. And finally, of course, climate change. Everything, will we see the weaponizing of the impacts? Wildfires, population displacement is a big topic in many parts of the world, not least here in Europe. Will it be accelerated by climate change? Will we see a migration of criminality and terrorism potentially? I don't know. I mean, I think things like weaponizing the impacts of climate change, like wildfires, is sort of low complexity to carry out high impact. So I think across these really big macro themes, they're all going to have, in one way, shape, or form, an impact in many parts of the world, including on our domestic environments. So leading to the domestic security risk, again, I picked 3 topics. I won't go them in too much detail. You can read them for yourself. And I'm sure everyone's got familiarity with this. And by domestic risk, by the way, I kind of mean, Western developed economies, obviously including Canada. I think, extremism society, whether across the various kind of activist groups you see there, whether through economic hardship and through my own experience of underwriting kind of extortive crime, there is data you can point to around an increase in extortive white-collar crime in developed economies following the last financial crash of the late first decade of the 2000s. And radicalization, this is something that increasingly, I think, particularly corporates are aware of when it comes to things like workplace violence. And these are all potentially threats which can be exacerbated by the macro risk environment, which I referred to on the previous slide. So I think that's kind of, without getting too granular and too deep into it, I think important context for how we look at the malicious and hostile risk environment out there right now. And with all that context in mind, what does this mean from an insurance context? Some of what we looked at are genuine, global, threatening, systemic issues. Can insurance really, to kind of coin a phrase, touch the sides? But I do think, at an on-the-ground level, businesses and organizations still need to navigate the world as best they can, looking for opportunity that, try and mitigate and transfer and manage that risk as best as they can. And that's where we really do believe that insurance can play a valuable role helping organizations and people across all these areas, and genuinely be a kind of business enabler, helping them to achieve their ambitions and to face the threats that are out there. And admittedly, some threats, are potentially unmanageable, but insurance as a means of not only transferring, but also to mitigate and manage this risk in these complex areas. We think this is where the Lloyd's market, as it has done throughout its 300+ year history, really stepped up, identified the context in which risk sits, and identified the most innovative way of bringing product to market, which helps organizations transfer that risk. So with all of that in mind, I'd like now to talk specifically about 3 products that I want to focus on today. And these are, as I said earlier, in some forms well-established. Kidnap and ransom insurance goes back to the 1970s in terms of becoming a sort of quite mainstream product. Its first policy was underwritten in Lloyd's, I believe, in the 1930s, which was off the back of the kidnap of the young son of the US wealthy individual Charles Lindbergh. But really, the kind of mainstream for this product was the 1970s. But still, it's not a widely understood or perhaps widely appreciated product. In more recent times, active shooter, and I'm going to explain a little bit later why that's a bad name for that product, active assailant, have started to become more prevalent, particularly in the US market for obvious reasons, particularly for people, smaller businesses, which could be, from a business interruption and liability perspective, potentially catastrophically exposed to something like this happening on their property or in and around them. And then finally, broad form crisis response, which I know, as I said right at the beginning, is potentially a poor name for something which I think is a tremendously interesting piece of innovation in the hostile malicious risk space, and which is really being pioneered in the Lloyd's market. And I hope Samphire Risk as a component of that market is leading the way. So just getting into the kind of the weeds a little bit of each product in turn. So Kidnap and Ransom, as I said, been around really for 40 plus years, but probably only in the last 25 years has it become something that has really started to address a much wider range of scenarios. And I like to think in that sense, it's a really great product, but it has a lousy name. It may be a name that kind of captures the imagination. Perhaps, there's been the odd Hollywood movie about it, because Kidnap and Ransom are highly emotive words, and put them together and, everyone's kind of got that scenario in their head. But it's certainly not a scenario that perhaps, the majority of people or organizations around the world, particularly in inverted commas safe environments, feel as relevant. But I also think, most people who've had some tangential involvement with this product probably don't appreciate that it's how broad it goes. That there's at least a dozen scenarios it can cover. So the ones I've got on the screen would be the kind of basis of the product we put into market, like many. And you can see it really does cover a broad range of different scenarios. Kidnap is the name it always seems to be led with. It's extraordinarily wide how it covers people. So if you're an organization, it would cover all your employees, all their families, any guests on premises, any contractors, volunteers. So from a duty of care perspective, it's a ginormous net that can sweep up more or less anybody that in one way, shape or form, a family or a corporate or a non-profit, whoever it may be, has potentially a duty of care to. And that covers 24/7 globally. So, and I think what everyone does know who's come across this product knows is that it can provide fantastic access to world-class experts to help resolve and support through any of the scenarios listed. But not everybody knows perhaps who the best companies are to undertake that service. It's very specialist, potentially very sensitive. And, the best company may be depending on where the nature of the incident and where it's occurred globally. That's the kind of expertise that you do find in Lloyd's, and which we hope we bring to the table. Really broad cover, backed by real expertise, and then kind of delivered seamlessly via a neatly packaged product. So I think Kidnap for Ransom, if you're going to take anything away, ignore what it's called. Look at the dozen or so scenarios that it actually covers, some of which undoubtedly are applicable in domestic markets. Extortive crime, stalking threats, malicious type of assaults. These are all things which happen in so-called safe environments. And with that in mind, I just wanted to, and with each of these products, I'd just like to give you an idea or an example of kind of typical underlying policyholders and a little rationale as to why they buy it. So I won't read out all of this, so please do read yourself. But I thought perhaps I'd give a couple of examples of real life Canada-based clients that I've had the experience of insuring. And obviously this is a highly confidential class. I certainly won't reveal any names or any specifics. But the first case that I would talk about was a junior mining exploration business, TSX listed. Obviously Canada's kind of market leading in the world for this type of organization. They go everywhere, sub-Saharan Africa, obviously Latin America, as I'm sure many of you know. In this particular case, the chief geologist was kidnapped by a breakaway political guerrilla group in Latin America. The individual was held for 4 months, quite clearly a very traumatic incident for the organization and the family. But, actually from an organization's perspective, it was a huge potential business threat to them. So being able to rely on the expertise and help that came in and actually to a degree allowed them to continue running their business safe in the knowledge that the family of the victim The various other stakeholders that needed to be kept informed, law enforcement, media, etc., were being dealt with, and the company could continue to try and focus on, developing its business, being accountable to its shareholders, etc. It's obviously a tool that brought the guy home safely eventually, but it also kept that business operating and ultimately in business. Another case involved was the fourth one. You can see down, a financial institution. It was a Canadian banking organization. It was the kid of one of the senior executives. Disappeared on an overseas kind of post-college trip, a gap year, we call it here in the UK. Sort of every parent's nightmare. Their kid had just disappeared, wasn't contactable. In that scenario, and this is in Southeast Asia, in that scenario, who do you actually contact? Law enforcement, locally or overseas. It's very difficult to know what to do. And I suppose there's a limited amount that government organizations can do in that scenario. So to be able to call on the power that this type of policy puts into the hands of the policyholder to dispatch, without delay, wherever in the world, consultants who know what they're doing in this type of scenario, have the relevant contacts into local law enforcement in those countries. It turned out to be a fairly innocuous reason why this kid disappeared, but nonetheless, he was found safely and quite quickly. But without the support of this policy, would that have resolved itself so quickly and smoothly for obviously very distressed parents? Arguably not. So the second product, active assailant insurance, lone wolf attacks, active shooter. This type of cover has many different names, depending on the provider, depending on who's talking about it. But from our personal perspective, we think that active shooter is a poor name, and I'll come on to explain why in a minute. Obviously, of course, this, as I said, this is mainly associated with the US, and I read a statistic from CNN yesterday that so far this calendar year, there's been more mass shootings, which I think is defined as 4 victims or more in the USA than have been days in January. We all know that this is obviously a big issue south of your border. But we don't call it active shooter insurance because the definition of weapon within most of these products is so broad. So here in the UK, for example, we've seen attacks which involved vehicles, blunt instruments, knives, rarely actually ballistic weapons. We, like Canada, we have a tighter gun environment, for want of a better expression. And we certainly don't always see events that have been inspired by terrorism, in inverted commas. It's not always ideologically inspired events. Often it could be disgruntled individuals with a grievance. You saw my domestic security environment context slide, highly motivated extremists. We're starting to see it in this country, the impact that climate change activists, animal rights activists, I'm afraid to say that they are right up to the line of doing something a little more destructive than the current protests that they're doing, which is mainly attacking physical assets. And sometimes these can be workplace violence events. The idea behind the product is to provide, really robust financial protection, which, as I mentioned, can be especially important to small businesses that get caught up, who are not necessarily always the target, but are often the victim, particularly for business interruption and potentially for liability. We had an example here in what was called the London Bridge attack in London 3 or 4 years ago, where many small businesses in an area called Borough Market were shut down for quite a few days. None of them had been direct targets to this particular attack, but they were all within the vicinity of it and had to be shut down. So the cover will cover at an actual location or within a 5-mile radius and provide the cover that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Also, in common with the Kidnap policy, there's that really important aspect of providing indemnified help and expertise when the situation has occurred. So, obviously these things are more often than not very led by law enforcement, but some of the business resilience, some of the potential public relations issues that you may have, some of the trauma counselling to staff who may have been directly impacted or indirectly impacted, some of the advice and assistance as to how to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again on your property. These are all services which are provided by the insurance policy to the policyholder. And increasingly too, insurance is packaged with risk mitigation solutions to help organizations understand how to avoid being a victim or to spot the early warning signs as to, perhaps erratic behavior in one of their employees or anything like that. And actually here in the UK, there's legislation which is coming before our Parliament later this I believe in the spring. And effectively, it's going to make all public spaces or publicly accessible spaces, so, theatres, cinemas, restaurants, bars, arena, etc., anywhere of 100 footfall and above are going to, by law, have to adhere to certain risk management procedures and risk management standards that if they don't abide by and are impacted by the type of event we're talking about, could potentially be breaking the law. So insurance will clearly have a role to play there from a liability perspective. So I think undoubtedly this is a modern era risk. And I think some of the context, think back to, potentially displaced, motivated criminality or terrorists, weapons which are potentially flooding out of war zones. I don't think it's, again, scaremongering or hyperbolic to say that potentially there are many things which could link together to make this an increasing risk in all parts of the developed world. So again, typically the types of organizations that we see consider this, the top two really, education, houses of worship. I'm sure we can all think of high profile examples, obviously again, particularly in the US, but certainly in other parts of the world where it's happened here. But really any area or industry profile that has a high profile and population that's attracted to it, footfall that's attracted to it, could be at risk. In Germany, we saw Christmas markets. In London, we've seen high density population places targeted. And we talked about this talk being about malicious and hostile risk at home and overseas. And I think actually, if you look at the top one, something like a university, nothing is truer to say that really a university faces on-campus risk of the type of potential marauding attacker that we've seen, but also potentially through their study abroad programs, their faculty travel into unstable or non-permissive parts of the world, how they're managing that overseas exposure. So actually the first two products we've talked about are increasingly being considered by organizations as their kind of fundamental overseas and domestic security risk management insurance programs. So moving on to the final specific product I wanted to talk about today. And I think this is going to be much less understood. It's relatively new to the marketplace. We have our own iteration, which obviously I would be delighted to go into any detail with anyone who's interested. But it's another example how Lloyd's, in our view, without overstating the point, is again kind of leading the innovation around how security risk management is addressed in terms of mitigating, managing, and transferring risk. So we call our version at Samphire Global Safeguard, because that's exactly what it is. We're safeguarding people, business interests, and assets globally. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen these 6 kind of buckets of risk that we look at. Now, most policies under these headings, and these are the headings we choose to use, others choose to use other ones, but broadly it's around duty of care, business integrity risk, financial compliance risk, political risks potentially, information and data risks, obviously cyber touches into that, some of the extortive crime, and then perhaps more around the political violence, systemic and property risk would be strikes, riots, civil commotion, things like that. This product is all about putting help and expertise into the hands of the policyholder before during and after an incident has happened. It's not about protecting the financial downside. There's insurance policies out there which do this. It's not widely available, as I said, but it's beginning to become considered a really sensible way for particularly mid-sized corporates, and I include Canada in this. There are Canadian corporates which are now buying this type of cover to manage downside and complex risk wherever they operate globally. So whilst a large corporate, so if you think of some of the largest corporates in Canada, would dedicate significant resource and capital to managing the kinds of risks you see on the right-hand side of this screen and what falls underneath those headings. For mid-sized corporates, it's just not realistic. It's not economic. It's not practical for them to maintain resource internal to their own organization to realistically manage these risks on a day-to-day basis. So they've looked to the insurance market to provide them with an economic and really easy to access way to access assistance, as I said, to over 40 defined threat scenarios on an as-needed basis. So it kind of takes that K&R concept of an incident hits you, you activate the policy to access help and expertise, but it provides on a much broader basis. So I think this is potentially the future of security risk management insurance that's coming out of the Lloyd's environment. As I say, I didn't want to get too granular today because there's a degree of complexity to it. It's taking the concept of insurance to help people actually mitigate risk as well, because this policy can be triggered before an incident has happened. The triggers on it are similar actually to some of you're seeing in the cyber world come in, that, if there's a credible suspicion or an imminent threat of something occurring or an allegation of something having occurred, the policy can be triggered. So you can see that it starts to become a risk mitigating tool, almost like a risk engineering tool for corporates. And I think is the next natural evolution of insurance playing a supporting and defining role in organizations going out into the world and trying to face the risks that we've kind of highlighted today. This slide here is actually lifted directly from a conversation we had with a Canadian extractives organization quite recently. And I show it because I think it brings to life a little bit what this broad form crisis response cover does for organizations. So I'll just run through the points briefly. As I said, most companies do not have internal resource to be able to manage most of the risks we looked at. If you're at risk of having a foreign asset expropriated, you're going to need external help to get that situation understood and potentially solved. So this is a way of doing that. There's no contracts, there's no kind of procurement process. It's an insurance policy, which you pick up the telephone, you access the help, and the policy pays. If you do have, as naturally extractive businesses are operating in some pretty unstable parts of the world, and sometimes they do have some in-house capability around managing these risks. Well, this is potentially an added limb to it. So it's a way of giving surge capacity or enhancing what you have. And then at the boardroom level, and I think this is what really resonated to the organization we were talking to, is they have to answer to many stakeholders, not least investors, staff, families, to be able to turn around and say, actually, well, we've identified the risk we're exposed to, and in an economic and sensible way. To the fourth point, we've obtained a means through the insurance market of managing this risk, which isn't unaffordable or beyond our means. And finally, and I think perhaps interestingly for you, all you insurance brokers out there who are placing many lines of insurances for your clients, potentially the way that the security risk management insurance is going is starting to provide a first line of defense to other underlying insurance programs. If you can get help and expertise ahead of something happening, are you potentially protecting a D&O policy, a property policy, whatever the policy may be? So I show you this slide because this is a real life example of how we found a potential policyholder thinking about how crisis response cover can help them enable their business. So that concludes, I hope, more or less on time. I said I'd speak for 30, 35 minutes. I think that's about right. Today's session. I hope you found it useful. I'm conscious I've covered a lot of ground, but I've tried to keep it relatively focused on, as I say, on those three products. My intent was to give some context to the risk environment in which we find ourselves now, and how some of the well-established products, such as Kidnap for Ransom, and how some of the newer insurance products, as we've just talked about, are now more than ever relevant and perhaps beyond the kind of traditional perception they've had. As it says here, our aim is always to provide insurance for the modern era of security threat, and really at its core, it will always be about these three key aspects. Using insurance as an enabler to get genuine expertise at the moment of need, making sure that your policy is managing that duty of care that increasingly, either through moral or statutory basis, you have, and obviously the liability which can fall out of potentially not managing that duty of care correctly, and giving organizations the ability to respond and recover as, you know, they increasingly have pressure to go out and generate returns for their shareholders, whoever it may be, in a world which, as we looked at right at the beginning, is not necessarily uncomplicated right now. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. I hope that's been helpful, and I'll hand back to Mark now.
Charlie, thank you very much. I mean, I think that was great. You certainly gave us, you know, at least introduction to some pretty interesting products. I've got a question here. I think I might be able to help a little bit. Rob has asked, is there any data to demonstrate Canadian policy premium for such products within the Lloyd's market, past, current, and projections? You know, Rob, we can look into that and find a little more. You know, the easy way to answer this would be if we had sort of statutory numbers. Much of these products gets, I guess, wound into general liability and casualty classes for reporting statutory purposes. So if you leave that with me, we can see if we can't find some more information on that and find maybe an effective way to communicate that after the fact, once we can dig into it a little bit. Listen, Charlie, just while maybe perhaps we wait for another question or two, you know, a couple of things were kind of clear to me, and I know you only touched on a couple of the products within sort of the entire suite of insurance products that you specialize in, that Samphire specializes in. But it seemed to me pretty clear, especially with the last, that in many respects, I think it's the consulting services and the expertise that comes along with the products that might be in many cases every bit as valuable as the actual sort of indemnity component of the insurance.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, you know, looking at insurance in this field, not necessarily as a total risk transfer mechanism, but as a conduit to accessing help and expertise really quickly without complexity, and confident that, you know, it's being paid for effectively, in simple terms, by an insurance policy. You know, I think that's where it's such a powerful tool for risk management. You know, obviously balance sheet protection is well addressed across many of the P&C classes. So really, again, what we're focusing on is getting that help and expertise into the hands of people that need it in an efficient and indemnified manner.
That's great. You, a question came up, and I think you did mention it in a couple of examples, but, you know, for our distribution partners on the webinar who are thinking about this, can you give some examples of Canadian sectors that, you know, might be particularly tuned with, you know, purchasing products like these?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the extractives industry, I think, has been you know, Canada's at the absolute global forefront of it. So whether it's exploration or production, you know, over my career, I've seen so many examples of Canadian mining companies going everywhere, and quite often, you know, they're driven to look at these products simply by nature of, or by virtue of the environment they're operating in, less perhaps driven by kind of duty of care and whatnot. But I think that has definitely changed. I know from talking recently to a contact in the extractive industry in Canada that some legislation coming in around how listed businesses have to demonstrate in an auditable and kind of formalized manner how they're addressing risk is turning attention to these types of product, because everyone to one shape or another knows how to transfer balance sheet risk, but not necessarily that, as we've been talking about, that kind of that response, that mitigation of risk. Canadian media, over the years, we've had good interaction with some of the other ones I put on the list, financial institutions, Canadian pension funds, and education. And I guess increasingly tech and pharmaceuticals as well.
Excellent. I know that you said maybe it's not the best name, Kidnap or Ransom, especially when you kind of ran us through the breadth of really what the product covers. But when you think about that, you think about it in its more appropriate, broader form. What countries would represent some of the highest risk, and where as risk consultants we ought to be advising clients to think about that product?
Yeah, I mean, from a pure kind of kidnap and ransom risk, and bear in mind, the dozen or so scenarios which are covered under that policy. But really purely looking at kidnap, it hasn't really changed hugely in the last 10, 15 years. Mexico, it retains its kind of number one spot for this type of crime and an issue, obviously mainly driven by cartel and economic impoverishment. Nigeria, if we're moving east, again, a lot of criminality, some terrorism driving the issues around kidnapping, both actually, frankly, onshore and offshore. Offshore of Nigeria, there's been a proliferation in the last decade of kidnapping crew and hijacking of vessels. But then you have flare-ups, which can sometimes be dependent on a rapid deterioration in the political environment. And the most obvious examples I can give you would be places like Iraq, Syria, Libya, where as dictatorships, highly controlled, frankly, very safe places to be. But the moment that political stability fell away, and for good reason, in terms of people rising up against vicious dictators, but what you've seen is the security environment completely collapse, and suddenly organizations which have been operating there without too much issue are suddenly confronted by the types of risks we're looking at. But really, Latin America and parts of Africa continue to lead the way.
Interesting. Yes, certainly destinations for Canadian industry and commerce, so that's helpful. I guess maybe I had a question that I wanted to kind of pose to you, and at the risk of sounding a little self-serving, but what is it you think about Lloyd's that kind of makes it a pioneer in some of these specialist products, and as we talked about, the services, the consulting risk services that go along with it?
I think, when anyone asks me to describe Lloyd's, I sometimes describe it as like atoms colliding in a big building. And I know I'm talking about the building in London and not, representation of the franchise globally, but it's all part of the same organism. It's a genuine marketplace. And I think it's funny, when we look back in a few years' time, whether we'll see a drop off of product innovation during COVID times, because you didn't have that kind of colliding of atoms in the market space, the collaboration around risk, because we often share risk, and also the fact that there's a lot of risk engineering associated with Lloyd's, which brings to the surface developing risks, brings to the surface risks which are perhaps not on the mainstream radar yet. So I think the combination of it being a genuine marketplace, we have collaboration, people who get creative just by knocking into each other like atoms, really means that Lloyd's has an advantage in that sense. But probably at its core, it's the DNA. It's the DNA. The moment I walked into that building, the moment I started to be associated with Lloyd's, it's how do you do something, not how do you not do something, is the kind of the DNA of the organization. And maybe it's got a little harder to do that with regulatory changes, market fluctuations, etc. But I still think it's a tremendous place for collaboration around innovation.
Well, listen, so Charlie, thank you for that. I couldn't have really penned it better myself. I in entire agreement. And thank you for sort of highlighting for all of us a really interesting, probably lesser understood suite of products that obviously are absolutely critical for those engaged in certain activities, traveling to different parts of the world. Something that I think we should all be thinking about on behalf of a number of Canadian clients across multiple industries. Samphire does a great job of representing the Lloyd's market. Thank you for that. And we appreciate your time today.
Mark, I think, sorry about that.
Yeah.
I think we have a few questions.
Do we? I'm sorry, I couldn't see them.
Sorry
I'm
about
sorry.
that. Do you want me to run through them?
Yeah, we have a little bit more time left if people are interested, of course. Please.
Okay. So the first question we have is the product available for luxury retail industry, enclosed malls?
Absolutely, all three are. And absolutely all three are bought by that type of profile or policyholder. If you're looking at active shooter scenarios, shopping malls have sadly not been out of scope. From a kind of if you're an international brand with your high profile brand in shopping malls in places like Latin America or Africa or parts of Asia, you'll have a duty of care to staff in that environment. And often high profile brands are very attractive for extortive criminality. So absolutely across all three products, and actually tangential to that, kind of high end, and obviously Canada has its fair share of well-known brands in this space, but kind of high-end hospitality and hotels. I think hotels in particular have been very unfortunately targeted both by terrorism and kind of non-ideologically inspired attacks, and clearly have a massive duty of care responsibility to all their staff and guests on site. So high-end retail, high-end hospitality and hotels are absolutely in scope for these products.
Great, thank you, Charlie. I have another question in the Q&A. It's from Marco, and he's asking, how was the active Assailant product been sold to small and micro businesses in North America? Meaning, is commonly part of packages, affinity groups?
I think that's probably fair to say that it's often sold alongside property programs or kind of what we would call combined commercial insurance packages here in the UK. And often it's very affordable, relatively low limit. Like all insurance, if the product doesn't fit the distribution, the policyholder is not going to see it and not going to buy it. So for big international organizations, they would tend to find their way to somewhere like the Lloyd's market. But the Lloyd's market is very adept at getting these products, which are highly specialist, perhaps paring them down a little bit, making them affordable, and then putting them to the correct distribution channels, whether that be through cover holders or open market correspondent brokers on the ground, to package up with other solutions as well. So I think there's many ways to skin that cat. The product's quite malleable to fit the end customer.
Yep. I think we have no more questions. So Mark, I'll let you continue with your closing. Thank you.
Yeah, as prematurely as it was initially, I apologize for that, Charlie. Obviously,
No worries.
I'm a lot more interest in this, and I wasn't keeping my eye on the right Q&A box. But again, just briefly, thank you very much for your time. Clearly, there is a great deal of interest, and I know some people have inquired about how to get in touch with you. It's Charlie Hanbury, Charlie.Hanbury at Samphire, Samphire ISK, Samphire Risk, I apologize.
SamphireRisk.com, yeah.
Yeah, SamphireRisk.com. And we'll leave it at that. Thank you all. Until next time, we'll look forward to hosting another Canadian Roadshow webinar, and we'll speak to you again then. Thanks, everyone. Have